Hi, everybody. Good afternoon from Washington, D.C. Welcome to the CAI Live Q&A webinar on COVID-19 and what phase are we in now. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. I'd like to thank our presenters, Brad Pomp, who is CEO of Sentry Management, headquartered in Florida, and Sue Tarley, who is a community association lawyer, fellow of the College of Community Association Lawyers in Williamsburg, Virginia. Welcome, Brad. Welcome, Sue. Thanks so much for being with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody for joining us. These are really interesting times, and CAI is pleased to be able to host these webinars to help people build their toolbox and gather information that will help them make decisions they are dealing with in their communities related to opening pools, opening clubhouses, navigating social distancing in communities, and all the other issues related to this pandemic. I want to remind everyone that while we have really bright people on the call, including a lawyer, the purpose of this call is not intended to provide you with legal advice or specific advice for your specific community association issues. It's really intended to provide you with some perspective, additional information on what other people are doing and what other people are thinking about. So this is not legal advice. Definitely reach out to your community association lawyers, your management companies, insurance, etc., and put all of that material together as you're making these decisions. I would like to share with you our sponsor of today's webinar, which is Appfolio. I'd like to give a special shout out to Appfolio Property Manager, thank them for their generous support of Community Associations Institute and their generous support of this webinar. By the way, this week, CAI would have been hosting our annual conference in Florida. We're so sad not to be there. We're really sad. I think the thousands of people who usually join us are sad as well. But we are looking forward to seeing everybody next year in Las Vegas. So please join us. And I know Appfolio was looking forward to seeing everyone in Florida as well. Again, thank you so much to Appfolio for their sponsorship. I'd like to play a video that Appfolio put together for us today to share their perspective on what they're doing during this pandemic and their support of community associations.
Hi, everyone. My name is Justin Davis, and I'm a Senior Product Manager at Appfolio. Appfolio is so happy to be sponsoring today's webinar. Appfolio is an all-in-one community management solution that helps you with all aspects of your business, from accounting to mobile violations and self-service tools for your homeowners and your board members. And perhaps most crucial in these times is mobility. Appfolio is fully mobile, which is more important than ever as many of us have had to work remotely and still need to operate at maximum efficiency. The topic of today's webinar is very important to us, as we see it as the first step to returning to some sense of normalcies in our day-to-day business and in your customer service. If you'd like to learn more about Appfolio, you can visit us anytime on the web at appfolio.com. Enjoy the webinar.
Appfolio for their generous support. Sue, Brad, are you guys ready?
We are ready.
All right. We are going to get on with the show. So as usual, the first 30 minutes of this program will be some frequently asked questions that we are hearing in the industry that Brad and Sue specifically are hearing. They're going to ask and answer those questions. And then at the second part, the second 30 minutes, we'll have an opportunity for everyone to post their questions, and we will do our best to answer those questions. If you're on a computer on this app, you'll see a control panel on your screen that has a tab for questions. Click on that questions tab, post your question, and we'll do our best to get to those questions. Also, if you want this slide deck under the handouts, you'll be able to access the slide deck there. Okay, Brad, Sue, I'm going to pass it over to you. Sue, I think you are the first one with the questions. I'm going to turn off my video camera and let you guys go. Thanks again for being here, and have fun.
All right, thank you, Dawn. And welcome everybody. I hope that we give you some good information today and that it helps you as you navigate the crazy times that we are in. So first question is, what regulations and guidelines need to be considered when deciding to open the areas of your associations that have closed? I think the first one that we all start with is most states are dealing with executive orders. And so you're going to go to your executive order and see what's permitted in your state. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention also has a great website and commonly referred to as CDC, and it's going to give you a lot of guidelines that you can follow. And the interesting thing is that if you have community spread in your area, you're also going to want to look at the guidelines that they might have for such a community. The World Health Organization also has guidelines for you. Your state health department does, and for us, we did have a community spread early on, and so it was nice to be able to look at those guidelines, which were much more stringent than some of the other ones that were being suggested, so that we could advise clients and that we could understand what our safety issues were. CAI, I will mention too, also has a lot of helpful guidance and information, and I've had some of my clients find information on there concerning letters that might go out to the community and things of that nature. And then there's also some great safety tips. For most, we're looking at reopening facilities. So we're talking about recreational facilities, we're talking about clubhouses, and another great resource for you is going to be different entities that handle recreational sports. So if you have pools, tennis courts, pickleball courts, and the like, you may want to consult USA Swimming. They have a whole section on COVID-19 and safe swimming practices. The US Tennis Association, the USA Pickleball Association, and USA Basketball and US Soccer. And so some of those entities have covered this, and you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can see what some of the risk factors might be, and then put those into the guidelines that you're going to follow. But again, I do want to emphasize that your executive orders in your state are the real law to look at this point in time in terms of what you're allowed to do. Brad?
All right, thank you. And a bit of a related question, does a community association have to open common areas, including pools, gyms, clubhouses, if the state relaxed their stay-at-home order? And certainly we're seeing different states in different phases. Even some states have segmented components that the municipalities are in different phases. And so as that happens, homeowners are applying a little more pressure as to their hope and desire that amenities will open. But the question is, do we have to open them? And the simple answer is no, you don't. And the real analogy that I have given folks to work with is, this is a floor. When you look at a government regulation or a government order, it's the floor of what a community needs to consider and do. It's not the ceiling. And so the analogy would be, in the event that you're aware of, maybe automobile manufacturing. And so automobile manufacturers have a certain set of guidelines and laws that they have to follow when they manufacture cars in the United States. But often those manufacturers go above and beyond that and have greater safety components in the vehicle than they're required to. And so it's certainly a good analogy here because, the associations are considering what do they need to do, and frankly, what do they need to do potentially beyond what regulations have been put in place. And so it certainly becomes a question not of do we have to open them, it quickly turns from a binary yes/no question to a much more gray area of should we open the amenity. And certainly a lot of that is going to depend on the many different variables that you have to deal with. And so if you think about it, is your community in a hot spot in the United States for the COVID virus? Have you had a high rate or even any rate of infection in your community of the COVID virus? That needs to be a concern. There's some common sense items to consider. You know, is the amenity inside? Is the amenity outside? You don't have to take the approach that we have to open all amenities at the same time. You know, certainly each amenity can be considered differently. Different rules built around each amenity based on some of the guidelines that Sue just talked about, and helpful components that boards can consider. Certainly, you know, we have to be careful when we talk about age-restricted communities, but, you know, this virus, you know, does have a greater impact on folks that are over the age of 65. And so if you're in a community that's a 55+ community, certainly some of those things are worthy of considering as you start to put policies in place and consider, should you open those amenities? And so those are the, you know, items to consider. Certainly, you know, as you go to consider those items, most insurance policies do, you know, have an exclusion for a pandemic. So, you know, it starts to become a liability issue also, and the board needs to consider how much risk can they mitigate and how much risk are they willing to take as they start to open some of these amenities. So hopefully everybody you know, can work through those conversations. We know there's a lot of pressure from homeowners right now as we get into the summer months.
For our third question, the question is, to minimize the risk of infection and spread of the disease, can we enlist volunteers to clean and sanitize pool areas, furniture, and other common areas? If not, what do we suggest? Many associations are finding a shortage of help, and so we've, at least in Virginia, we're seeing letters from pool companies that say we have a shortage of lifeguards, and we also don't have any pool attendants for you either. When we look at the issue for our executive order in Virginia, and I have a feeling it probably follows for a lot of other executive orders, the burden of responsibility is put on the association to make sure that there's compliance with all of the requirements that are being put in place for you to be able to reopen. So you've got this staff shortage, and yet you're responsible for, one, supervision, sanitization. You're also responsible to make sure that your owners are complying with what their requirements are in terms of limitations, physical distancing, and those kind of things. So I think you probably can use volunteers, but I think it's a process that you have to look at. We can use committee members to do board business, and so I think you would probably be looking at establishing a committee of sort. But, and here's the big but, it takes a lot of work to do this, because I believe that, one, you have to comply with all of the staff requirements that are in your executive order or in whatever your guidelines are in your state for being able to reopen. And so, at least for us in Virginia, the executive order talks about staff and what they're required to do. There's training of staff. There are various protocols in terms of what they have to wear face masks. They also, you may want them to sign a waiver or an acknowledgement of the risk that they're undertaking. And we also have daily screening, asking questions about, do you have COVID-19? Have you been exposed? Or do you have any of the symptoms? So I think you have to treat those volunteers in a similar fashion as what paid staff is required to do under executive orders. You also would want to consult, obviously, with your attorney, with your insurance agent, to make sure that you hit those marks and that you actually can use some type of volunteer. We do not recommend that you have your owners self-monitor. I think that is kind of a disastrous situation. Owners right now would really like to get back into using their facilities, and it's really not their responsibility. Well, it is their responsibility, personal responsibility, to make sure they comply, but the burden has been put on the association to make sure these things are in place and that they're followed. Okay, our next question is, what and how should these reopening plans and procedural changes be communicated to residents? And Brad and I are both going to talk about this a little bit. Communication is tantamount at this time, and for a couple reasons. One, we believe if you stay really connected with your communities, that you also are going to probably experience less of a drop off in people paying their assessments. You need to let them know what you are doing and that you're still operating and that you're still at work. Many owners are not in tune with how much is required to reopen. Basically, we had headlines that said phase 2, reopen your pools. And that's what they saw. And so there's sanitization that has to take place, monitoring, and limitations on use. And all of those things need to be communicated to your owners so they know why it's taking you maybe some time, why you have to get signage, why you have to have a policy in place, why you're talking to your insurance agent. And I think the more that you can communicate to them, the better off that you will be, because they start to see the effort that you're taking to try and open your facilities.
That's right. It, certainly, and I suspect the experience across the country has been the same. The communities and boards that have done the best job at communicating with their homeowners are the ones that are being the most successful in terms of having homeowners understand, why a certain position has been taken. We, have provided, from a practical point of view, three piece of advice for our boards as they communicate with their communities. And so we ask them to make sure you have an official channel. Sometimes, if there's a great list of emails of homeowners, maybe it's a smaller community or condominium, everybody knows exactly that, those official postings from the boards are coming out through email, and then maybe also posted in a common area. But maybe through the mail, the U.S. mail, maybe even a social media site, which isn't necessarily our recommendation, because sometimes you can get some other chatter. But make sure if you are posting official communication through that medium, that you're at least displaying in a way that it is clearly from the board. What you don't want to have is communications from the board getting mixed in with other messages and folks confused about the rules. The second is transparency. This is supported by what Sue talked about when we opened the webinar today, is make sure you support your communications with the guidelines that are put out there by the real experts, whether it be the USDA or CDC or World Health Organization, whatever it might be. As you post certain rules or guidelines, that it is supported and you're transparent as to why a certain decision was made, and certainly providing the not just the here's the decision, but the who, what, why, and where, and really informing homeowners is going to be the transparency that helps keep your community as calm as possible. And the third is credibility, and making sure that if you have valuable partners for your community or as a manager, you're using that resource. Certainly as a community association management company, we have the opportunity to work with a lot of different communities, a lot of different vendors, a lot of different attorneys, and we get to see best practices. And if you compile those best practices across your manager, your attorney, the different vendors that you work with, and bringing that level of credibility to your decisions, it will certainly help. I don't think, certainly you can, if you go to the extreme, over communicate. And so, but in general, I think, finding a good cadence of communication, whether it's weekly or bi-weekly, and letting your homeowners or unit owners know exactly what's going on, where the board is important. And don't be afraid to also send out a message that states, hey, we have reviewed it and nothing's changed since our last communication. At least they know that there's an ongoing review in the community and that the status was reviewed by the board but hadn't changed, and then there's no questions as to what's going on. But that ongoing communication really is critical. And so let me take on, and here's another question, hopefully Sue will address a little bit as well. Really a current question. During a time with high emotions in the current climate, how should a community association board or manager address difficult conversations with colleagues and residents? And this question is certainly coming up quite a bit. And just to kind of set the table a little bit, I think everybody knows this can be a challenging industry to work in on a I'll use the term in quotes, air quotes, a normal day. But beginning in February, certainly our lives changed and a lot of stress came with that. A lot of people are at home and they are sending a lot more emails. Our email volume has gone up quite a bit. And we're seeing a lot more architectural review requests. And then beyond that, certainly in the last couple of weeks, we've all, or many of us seen a very sickening video that gave us pause for thought. And as a result, a deep cultural and racial conversations taking place. And what we're hearing from our managers, if you consider all of those factors, is they're overwhelmed, and it's a tough time. And so really, what we're doing is trying to give guidance from 2 points of view. One point of view is how do you handle the day-to-day interactions and the ongoing business that needs to take place. And the first recommendation I would have is make sure you've got a self-awareness of where you're at in each moment. If you've just gotten off a really challenging conversation on a telephone call and you're not ready to take that next call when it comes in, don't answer the phone and get yourself in another unpleasant conversation or say something that you may regret. Let that go to voicemail. Just make sure you obviously return that call in the next 5, 10, 15 minutes and have timely resolution there. Same with emails. If you're wondering if maybe you shouldn't write what you're writing, put it aside for 15 or 30 minutes and come back to it and have that self-awareness and make sure that you're really monitoring the words that you're using on those emails as well as in personal conversations. I think always understanding that the vast majority of conversations where homeowners are upset are not personal. They're not directed necessarily at the community manager, although it feels that way. They're upset about a certain rule or policy or decision that was made, and it ends up being directed at the manager. And so really taking a moment to understand what the issue is and then compartmentalizing that part of the conversation and making sure that they feel heard has really helped us guide homeowners through some of those challenging conversations and the stress that they're having right now. And I always reiterate, don't be afraid to apologize. There's always 2 sides of the story, and it doesn't mean that somebody's wrong. But I think if you frame the statement, if that has been your experience, starting with but if that has been your experience, I'm sorry that's happened. Let me help you get resolution. And I find that those words diffuse more conversations than any other words that I could use. And then let me talk about it. So that's kind of day to day. And then let me talk about it more from an industry perspective. I have a bit of excitement around it in the sense of the industry that we're involved in really has an opportunity to take a leadership position in this conversation. And that doesn't mean that in our roles, we necessarily are change warriors or cultural warriors, but we are working with a diverse amount of communities on a daily basis. And we have an opportunity to touch those communities and make sure that they understand that it is important to treat every neighbor equally, to make sure there's no discrimination in their communities, and to make sure they're certainly following the laws as it relates to equal housing. And I'm a bit excited about how our industry can impact that. Sue?
I would really echo a lot of things Brad said. There's a lot of anxiety out there. We have the pandemic, the loss of jobs, I think is a big one also for us. And then coupled with the protests and kind of outcry for racial equality, it is overwhelming. And here, most of the managers that I am associated with are working just 24/7 to try and get the communities up and running. And so it's really, I think it's overwhelming, but it also shows you a lot of the good in people. And so it's really trying to also focus on what that good is. But if you don't have a non-discrimination policy for your neighborhoods, I think really now is the time to either do one or to renew that. I think we have to send that strong message. We have CAI policies on this. We have fair housing that many of us teach on and have to comply with. And so I look at it and say management, the board, council, and other business partners are the leaders of these communities. And so we need to lead and let them follow, and we need to keep that going in all of our communities. Setting an example with civility, compassion, empathy, I think those are the roles that we have to play. And don't get me wrong, I have my days too where I'm like, I've had enough. I can't do this right now. And I think Brad's words are right. Sometimes you just don't take the phone call, get yourself together. We have to take some self-care also and make sure that we are kind of resetting so that we can give the best advice, that we're focused, and that we're able to listen to what people are maybe actually telling us aside from what we think they might be saying. But, you know, all of you are going to get comments about the pandemic and executive orders that don't make sense and not sure why we're doing this. And you're going to get concerns about, you know, are we going to have protests? And I think we just need to be prepared for those questions and make sure that we answer them responsibly. Okay, next is what types of questions are you getting related to assessments? That's a big change up from our last question. And so for assessments, getting a lot of questions about, you know, there's worries about, are we going to be collecting fully from everyone? What if we have people who have experienced a job loss or been laid off for a period of time, or, you know, have COVID-19? What do we do? And some are asking if they can defer certain reserve spending, or if they can change and not be submitting the money, not funding their reserves, and instead using that in their operational budget. And they're also asking questions about whether or not, for the reserves, on whether or not they can borrow from their reserves. To take any actions related to your assessments, in most instances, you're probably going to have to kind of go back and maybe redo your budget. Some of the advice out there for small businesses is you should be doing your budget at this point in 13-week increments, because there are going to be adjustments that you have to make. But I think if you want to take any of those actions related to your reserves, or if you are looking at maybe waiving late fees or extending payment time, you really need to first look and see, does the board have the authority to do this? And so you've got to confirm that. Then I think you have to go through the analysis to say, is this a good idea for our association? Is it in our best interest? What does it do to us financially as we make these decisions? And then you have to figure out what's the right action to take. You know, are you a board that approves your budget? Do you go in and do an amended budget? Or do you have to go back to your owners to get some type of approval? And so you have to be really prepared when you're doing this in terms of your analysis to know your financial impact of the decisions you might be making.
That's right. And so as it relates to financial items, what type of financial analysis of a budget, financial forecast should be completed by an association during this time? So first and foremost, if you haven't done a review of where you stand financially, I certainly hope you will soon. Really critical. Certainly assessment tardiness lags from, you know, some of the initial you know, unemployment numbers that have come in, and I expect some communities are really going to feel it over the next 3 to 6 months, depending on how long this continues. But you know, where I always start is as it relates to cash and cash management. You know, you're running a corporation. Cash is going to be the lifeblood of continuing the operations of that organization. And there's a few items that certainly are important to do in that process. So if you start with the income statement, you know, compare that budget to actual. And I certainly agree with what Sue said. It may be important to start shortening the time frame that you're really looking at. What action are you going to take as it relates to where you're starting to see greater and greater variances between the budget and the actual, and start looking at that in 3-month chunks or 13 weeks. Start to review all the items on that budget for essential need. Is it something that needs to take place? Is it something that can be delayed or deferred? And certainly there's some vendors out there that you have long-term relationships with. You know, those vendors are very interested in keeping a long-term relationship, and they may be willing to come to some agreements that may help you through a particularly tough time if you get into a cash crunch. But really, I think where the analysis is going to be most beneficial from a forecasting point of view is probably going to come from your analysis of the balance sheet. Where I'd start is, once again, looking at your cash balances and really watching where that cash balance changes over time. You know, and some of that is expected, particularly if you're, you know, have an annual assessment and it comes in once a year, you're expecting to see that cash go down, but you need to monitor, is it going down at the rate that's expected? If you're getting monthly assessments, it's a little easier to watch and see if those cash balances are starting to trickle down a little bit as receivables are starting to go up. A good number that we like to watch is the number of months that you have operating cash available. And so as you enter this, once again, you got to kind of monitor, is it an annual assessment, a quarterly, but the number of months that you have available to operate the community. If you had at the beginning of this pandemic 4 months of cash available and you're now down to 2 months, you know that you're going through cash faster than maybe you're able to do. Look at CD expiration dates. The CD rates, interest rates are very low right now. And so it may be more important to have that cash, you know, in a liquid format that you could utilize versus having it tied up in a CD where you may take some penalties if you ultimately have to pull it out of the CD. But the interest that you gain right now may be far less than what those penalties are. And so it may be worth just leaving it in an operating or a money market type account. And then certainly watching the two, you know, items as it relates to the receivables aging and the payables. If those numbers are starting to go up, either one of them, it would start to be a concern for me. But those are certainly starting analysis that we would do on any association of any size.
I think, Brad, we're going to move to that question on reserves. Can they be considered to cover current association expenses?
Yeah, this is typically probably in Sue's world more than mine, but let me give you maybe a couple pieces of practical advice, and maybe Sue can jump in and provide some of the legal side. But ultimately, you know, there's typically some state and community restrictions as to how those reserves can be used, and so you know, or can they even be borrowed against? And so for us, we look at it and go, you know, if you get into a real tight predicament, are there some gray areas that you could work through? So one example might be if you have a roof repair versus a roof replacement, can you use some of that money that's potentially been bucketed for roof replacement for roof repair? Same as swimming pool maintenance. Certainly that's not the swimming pool, you know, redoing the swimming pool, but that the money is potentially being put aside for. But if you could make a case, and it's within the bounds of the restrictions are in place, that, you know, by utilizing that money that was put in reserves for a swimming pool to do some of the just ongoing maintenance, it may prevent a much larger expense down the road. Once again, there's a lot to be considered there. You know, the reality is the challenge, and I hope we don't get to this point, but in 2010, we had a lot of communities that they were out of cash, and they had to make a decision: do we keep the utility lights on, or the utilities on, such as light, and go into reserves or not? I hope we don't get to that point, but certainly if you do, you've got to make sure that you are documenting everything that you're doing, documenting the you know, the challenges, that the financial challenges in place, that 2 or 3 years down the road, when another board is reviewing it, there's not any question as to why, you know, the community made some of the challenging decisions that they made. Sue, I don't know if you have anything.
No, I mean, I would recommend that when you're doing that you make sure you consult with your counsel to make sure you have authority to do what you're doing. I think right now some of our analysis is financially driven, and based on the pandemic and the losses in our economy, we're going to see different decisions being made on some of these areas. But it's going to be driven by your state law and by, you know, your documents in terms of what you can do. Our last question that we're going to have, and then we'll go to the Q&A. Annual meetings and transition meetings may be held in the coming months. How should annual meetings proceed? What about elections? Well, we're still recommending that you continue to have remote meetings for your annual meetings as well as your transition meetings. there's an ability to hold meetings, you know, in many states right now, because there has been an expansion of how many people can be together in one area. And so if your state has that, I think we start to get a lot of pushback on, can't we do things in person again? Well, in person still means that you probably have some requirements for physical distancing, you probably have requirements for sanitization, and there's still a risk factor out there. As much as all of us would like to think, hey, we're reopening and things are over, they're really not. And you know, I'm not the science person you want to rely on, so we rely on, you know, what we have out there from the experts in terms of what we're allowed to do. So we're still recommending that you do those meetings remotely. Holding those meetings remotely seems to be working for a lot of our associations. You do have to be creative in doing these things. CAI has a great meeting process that I highly recommend that you read if you're going to do this. But using Zoom, GoToMeeting, or some other platform is actually pretty easy once you try it. So if you're going to do this for your annual meeting, don't start that night. Instead, work on it beforehand and probably engage some people in your community so the owner can call in. You can see how the technology is going to work for you. It's interesting because one of our big questions was, how do we take nominations from the floor? And we had a lot of communities that got really hung up on that language, and how are we going to satisfy everyone in the community that we have taken nominations from the floor? I think probably the best format that we've seen, and if any of you have used it and used something differently, I'd love to hear about it, but is the notice goes out for the meeting with the slate of candidates who have already said that, you know, have either been vetted by your nominating committee or however you're doing it in your community elections committee. And so they're on there, you got your notice, and then you give everyone a time period where you say, from this date to this date, we'll be taking nominations from the floor. And then people can submit their names, and you can go ahead and send out a revised ballot for everyone. I think doing it at the annual meeting when it's held through technology is difficult, because a lot of people will be sending in their ballots early, and then there's not necessarily the time for them to go ahead and change that ballot. And so this is what we came up with for a lot of our communities, and right now the jury's still out on it, but we'll let you know how that's going. The other thing I would say is just remember, this is new ground for all of us, and you know, we have to be flexible. You've got to look at these things on an ongoing basis. If something's not working, try something else. We also need to really work with each other, because I think we can learn a lot from each other, and that ultimately makes all of us better, especially when we're in the unknown and you know, a lot of uncertainty. And so it helps our communities, and it also helps all of us as business partners help each other.
Agreed.
I've learned a lot from Brad.
And I will tell you, not to take any of Dawn's time here, but as boards have gotten more comfortable with the technology and online meetings, we're getting very, very positive reviews on how efficient those meetings can be. Frankly, often how much quicker they go, and even they get more attendance because people can just attend, log in right from their homes. So there's a lot of positives that have been coming from the online meetings.
Awesome.
Hey, Dawn, there you go.
Nope, don't say it.
I didn't.
Okay, you guys did a great job. Thank you so much. We're moving forward to the live question and answer portion. We have a couple of questions that go back to the very first question you put out there, Sue, which is which guidelines need to be followed. So if the CDC is recommending a certain number for social gatherings, though I think they've really expanded using a variety of different circumstances, like you know, religious services, and so they've lots of different circumstances. But anyway, if there is a difference in guidance from the CDC and the state guidance, what should an association do? Which one should they follow?
They would need to follow the state guidance. The state, if the state guidance is through an executive order. Okay, so if you have an executive order, it is the law, it's what you have to follow. And for most states, there's some mandatory requirements, and so you follow those. If that is different than your CDC, we're going to advise you to follow the executive order. But you also have to look at kind of your own circumstances. Okay, so if you're in an area where maybe you're having a hot spot, you might want to follow a more stringent requirement that is set forth in the CDC guidelines. So it goes back to looking at the risk you have in your community and trying to figure out how do we best address it for our community. But I think that the easy answer is it's going to be whatever the law is, and that's going to come from your executive order.
Which I like what Brad said early on, which is that ceiling and floor comparison, right? So what's out there is the floor. You don't have to open, right? There are communities, I'm seeing some questions here. Communities are getting guidance from their legal counsel and their insurance counsel, saying that they just don't have the coverage, the liability coverage to justify opening their amenities, their pools, courts, etc. What are you hearing in your markets?
That's ultimately the challenge is, there's typically not going to be insurance coverage without getting into a long discussion of premises law, right? And the expectation of safety and health that needs to be provided if people are going to be invited into an area. There's going to be some people that, and I'm not here to pick on any plaintiffs' attorneys, but just I'm saying it from a factual based point of view, that there's going to be some folks that poke at that law and see, what liability may exist. Certainly from a very neutral point of view, if somebody becomes very sick and gosh forbid somebody has a family member that die, often they, down the road may seek a, financial recovery as it relates to that. And if they can tie it to an association in some way, shape, or form, I recognize it may be difficult, but that's where the liability comes in. And so it is a challenge, and it goes back to how much risk are you willing to accept? How much can you mitigate it through signage, through cleaning that your budget will allow for, right? Now, you might be taking on a lot more expense. One item that was interesting to me came across my desk yesterday is we found an insurance broker here in town in Orlando found a policy that is a bit of a gap policy, and it will pay, it's a per unit cost, and it pays for the attorney costs related to defend anything that's not in their regular insurance coverages. There's some exceptions, as with anything, and I'm not here to promote that line of insurance as much as saying there are some options for folks to consider out there. And there are some places to continue to mitigate the risk, particularly financial risk, further and further down along the way.
We've had that same kind of issue here. We worked with insurance agents early on, and many of them were suggesting the use of a waiver and release. And so we've implemented that in a lot of the neighborhoods. It's not necessarily something that everybody is real enamored with because they feel like they should be able, they in the past have been able to go to their facilities and not have to sign a waiver. But the uncertainty of COVID-19 kind of forces you into that. And it's also another way to manage that risk, especially when you don't have coverage for virus or pandemic. And then the insurance agents have also worked with us on telling us whether or not they would come in and defend on a lawsuit, even if there isn't coverage. Because I think the easy answer on that typically is no, if you don't have coverage, they're not going to defend you. But we've had some differences there, and maybe it goes back to what Brad mentioned, the gap policy. And so it is really working on those things to see how you can mitigate that risk. And then again, like Brad said, whether or not you're willing to take the risk.
So are you seeing any of your clients ask for those types of opinions in writing from their insurance carrier? So will you cover, will you defend if we open our pool?
Yes.
They're asking for it. I'm not sure I've seen any happy with the answer.
Right. Okay.
The answer's up front, and then there's a whole lot of other stuff in the letter.
Right. Okay. Fair, but good to have that in writing. How do you how do you address residents who believe that the state guidelines aren't laws that need to be followed?
Go ahead, Sue. I'll let you start on that one.
Well, we don't want to go back to the Magna Carta and come forward. So typically we're looking at the executive order and trying to show them, give them a link to the governor's, the website for the governor's office, because then you can see that the governor has this power to do these executive orders, especially, once they declare a state of emergency, it's fairly wide open on what a state can require. And so we just give that information that that's what the law is right now. We have to follow that. We could all disagree with it. I can tell you there's parts of ours where I'm like, I'm not exactly sure what that says, but we're probably going to take a pretty conservative approach because it all goes back to safety in terms of our interpretation of what the governor has put out there. I know in our state and probably in others, this is not just the governor sitting down and coming up with a bunch of rules. They are working with experts, they are working with business owners to try and come up with things that work. But it's very difficult to address every single type of business that is out there. Ours do not in particular address or specifically address community associations, and so we're trying to apply them. So it's going to remain an interesting ballgame.
Yeah, we've I mean, from a more practical, non-legal point of view, or maybe there's a legal on the end, but the challenge is we have certainly seen homeowners, press the issue quite a bit of, I'm paying my assessment, I'm going to the pool, I don't care what you say. And so then some respond well to a kind, notice from the community, some don't, and then you start to go through an unfortunate escalation process in terms of at what point do you hopefully have them respond, right? You may have a notice from the attorney, maybe even a general call from the attorney of, hey, here's why you have to conform to that law. It is the law, and we've even seen, unfortunately, some of these escalate into, fines. And then worst case, we've even seen it escalate into trespassing. And it's a terrible thing when you start getting neighbors versus neighbors into those discussions and those processes, but it is a reality. The board has a responsibility, as challenging as it is right now, to go through that and make sure that the community is following the regulations put in place.
So what authority or role does an association board or manager have in their association if their state has a rule, or in the governor's order, it says if somebody comes in, they have to, from another state, let's say you're coming in from New York to Florida, and they come into that community in Florida and they're supposed to self-quarantine for 14 days, but the board members, the residents see those people walking around the community during those 14 days, before that 14-day deadline is up. What role does the manager and board have in those cases?
I think they do play a role in that. Nobody wants to really self-police in that manner, but at the same time, they're in your community, and so it's going to affect the owners and residents that you have a responsibility to. And so I think initially it'd probably be a letter that says, or approaching them and saying, you're supposed to be self-quarantining. We know you just got here. And then at that point, if they're not going to listen to you, the association's council, association's management, I think it is probably figuring out, well, who do we call next to make sure this takes place? You hate to escalate these things to that point, but the safety factor for your own community is, I think, more important.
And once again, I'm not the lawyer on this call, but having those records documented down the line in the event that there is a claim, that, hey, there was an executive order in place. We followed that executive order in the sense of when a homeowner that came from an out of state or traveled internationally or whatever the case may be was not following the policies in place, that hopefully you communicated in advance also. But those letters are documented. They're in the records down the road that you can show we followed all the policies, we communicated it, we followed up, and then ultimately we went through an escalation process to try and have this person follow the rules.
Let's talk about board meetings again. So if associations, they were forced to start having web-based or video conference meetings, if it's not in there specifically in their governing documents allowing video conference meetings, but they were forced to have them and they're having them now, and they want to continue them indefinitely, is that going to be all right? Or do they need to do anything to make sure it's all right?
I think it depends on their documents in terms of can they adopt a policy? Do they need to look at changing their bylaws? Or do they have a state statute that permits them to take advantage of those type of meetings? And so I think you look at all three. I think a lot are probably going to want to take advantage of that. Some have really liked that ability, but I also have just as many who they admitted they miss each other. So they want to get together again in person, which is also a great thing in terms of our industry. So, but I think you have to look at the documents first to see what type of prohibition is in there, and then make your decision on whether it can be a policy, a bylaw amendment, or whether the state statute permits you.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, the restrictions are starting to ease. Early on, I'm not sure I'd like to use the term advice, but we counseled communities that, if you are restricted from that, right now there's not a governmental agency around that's going to come down on you for having those meetings electronically. But if that's your chosen path forward, you really need to get it in the documents that it's allowed and go forward with changing those rules.
So would you say the same for electronic voting in upcoming elections? If it's not in their documents right now and they want to use electronic voting, what would you suggest?
I would say the same thing.
Yeah, a similar process. I mean, certainly there's reasons to do it beyond COVID. And so if it benefits the community, get those rules changed so that the community can operate.
Have you talked about, have you worked with any clients that are using proxies in their annual meetings and how that's being handled and the counting of the proxies and things like that?
I can't speak to that directly. Sue, do you have a?
We have a couple that are using proxies, but the meetings haven't occurred yet. So we have sent out the proxies for them to be able to use. And we had to work with, I guess it's a software vendor in terms of the electronic voting so they could upload the right things. I don't really anticipate that we're going to have any issue with that. I think the bigger issue that we sometimes encounter is that the results of the voting are typically on like this data type sheet. And it's whether or not, like if you're doing a document amendment right now, how do you use that? Or is that going to suffice for electronic signatures? And so we've actually looked at, in certain instances, where we ask the software vendor to also include language that says, I agree that this is my electronic signature, to try and meet the terms of whatever your electronic signature statute is in your state. And those are, again, things like that we haven't really had to do in the past. And so we're really trying to have to figure out, how do you keep operating? Because we had a lot of document amendments that were out there, and they want to go forward. They want to finish up their project, and it's a challenge. There's no doubt about it.
What are your thoughts on liability waivers? So we'll open the pool if everyone signs a liability waiver.
Liability waivers are being suggested by a lot of our insurance agents, and obviously, as lawyers, we want you to get a liability waiver. We think it helps, I think, with two things in this situation. It sets the right expectation, because you typically have language in there that discloses that the dangers that are involved, that it's COVID-19. We can't guarantee that the premises is going to be COVID-19 free, and then you get this release. There are a lot of instances across the nation where those waivers are not enforced. There's probably a big question in terms of people under the age of 18 and how enforceable they are, but it does set the right tone, I think. It also dissuades litigation. And so, for most people, I don't think it's an issue for them to sign it, but we've had some pushback on those waivers. But I think if you can get them, I think it helps you in your community with managing your risk and hopefully mitigating that risk significantly.
Yeah, I would add, and certainly I may be out kicking my coverage on the legal side here, but I would add, I agree with Sue. There's quite a few states that those get holes poked in and they have a tough time upholding them. You know, the other one that came up in a discussion I had with an attorney that, you know, ultimately it would be determined in a court, but let's say someone has signed a waiver and they go back to their house and they infect someone from the, you know, they contracted it potentially at the gym and somehow can make that connection. They don't have the ability to waive a third party's rights. And so they've taken that infection back to their house and other people have contracted it. Certainly the waiver, you know, limits what folks think they may be able to do, but there's some challenges in there. I'm not downplaying waivers because I think they do have a use and can certainly be helpful in limiting and mitigating the risk. But I hope nobody thinks it's the golden ticket.
I'm sorry, let me just take this one step further. Go ahead, Sue.
No, just to what Brad said about the third, you know, going home and infecting somebody, we've, you know, included that in the waiver also. And again, how will we be able to enforce it? I don't know. I'm probably as good at answering that question right now because we don't know what the occurrence is going to be as I am at whether or not, you know, we'd even be able to trace the COVID-19. You've got some tracing cases out there, but they're pretty clear. You'd have to show that that person had gone nowhere else. And so I think there'll probably be difficult cases, but you don't want to base your decision on mitigating that risk on a lawyer saying, here's what I think the science is, because I don't know what the science is. So I think it's as good as it gets.
One follow-up and then two other questions, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. So the one follow-up is, so 99% of the people, 99 of the 100 residents signed that waiver. One person didn't. Do you restrict that person from going to the pool?
My one word answer is yes.
Okay. And okay, Zoom meetings. Can the board take a vote using private message in the Zoom meetings?
I think that would depend. Are they, you know, if the Zoom meeting is, well, no, I don't think it does depend. No, I'm going to say. Because I think they can meet in executive session, which means they can go into like the locked room in Zoom. I think that's what it's called, or the lobby. I'm not sure. But all your voting has to be out in the open. So I think the only time you get to do maybe private voting like that is when you have maybe the secret ballot for voting for directors. And I know there's also different opinions on that, on whether you can even do that, at least in Virginia.
I don't know.
I won't jump into that briar patch.
Yeah, I don't know what the genesis of the question is. I mean, if they're on a Zoom meeting, I don't know if they're trying to record it and have it documented, but you know, you could supplement the conversation and everybody having an open vote by having potentially something there. But if you're not transparent in the conversation and the voting, that's the first step to a real problem.
Yep. Again, this is not legal advice, so definitely talk to your attorney about how you're taking your votes, but just expertise from these two folks. Okay, we're going to wrap it up. Sue, Brad, thanks so much. I am going to give you an opportunity in just a few minutes to come back and give some closing comments to the audience. In the meantime, we talked a little bit earlier about there's so much going on right now in our country, and there's so much going on in our communities. CAI, actually the College of Community Association Lawyers, created a civility pledge for community associations to adopt, boards to adopt, managers to encourage, boards to adopt and share with residents, that really creates a framework for conversation about difficult issues. And not that everybody needs to come together and talk about every difficult issue that's out there, But in communities, there are difficult issues, and that difficult issue may be opening the pool or opening the pickleball court, or it may be discrimination. So whatever those difficult issues that are being discussed, I do encourage community associations to take a look at the Civility Pledge, and you'll find it on our website. I'm also going to share a video on the Civility Pledge to give people a bit more information about it.
Civility starts with me.
What we say and how we say it matters. Practicing civility in your community can make a difference.
Civility starts with me.
Civility starts with me.
La civilidad empieza conmigo.
Civility starts with me.
Introducing CAI's new Civility Pledge. A simple step to creating a community association where all residents are encouraged to express their views openly without fear of reprimand.
Civility starts with me.
By adopting the Civility Pledge, your community can create a climate of mutual respect and a safe place where residents are urged to ask questions and share opinions.
Civility starts with me.
Civility starts with me.
Talk.
La civilidad empieza conmigo.
Civility starts with me.
Listen.
Civility starts with me.
Civility starts with me.
Respect.
Civility starts with us.
Have you adopted the Civility Pledge?
Great. And then I also want to encourage people to go to our webpage. You will find direct access to links to where your state is in their phase plan. You'll find direct access to any local, county, city ordinances, etc. So lots of great information on our website. This particular webinar and all of our others have been recorded. You can access those on our webpage, caionline.org /coronavirus. Lots of frequently asked questions, as well as access to all of these videos. And we had a great one on insurance, great one on opening pools, etc. And I encourage everybody to go to our website as well, to our exchange. It's an open web-based forum to post questions. It's a discussion board. It's a great place to continue this conversation, to ask questions you may have, and you'll be surprised by the dozens of professionals all around the world who are willing to answer your questions. So I encourage you to continue that conversation. And I'd like to, again, give a shout out to our sponsor, Appfolio. Thank you so much, Appfolio, for your continued support of Community Associations Institute and all of our members. We really appreciate your financial support, and especially during these difficult times. I'd also like to recognize our national corporate members who are members of all of our chapters, all of our 60+ chapters throughout the world. So thank you to our national corporate members. I'm going to now take it back to you, Brad and Sue. I'll start with you, Sue, if you want to just make a few closing comments to the audience members. Sue?
Well, I really want to thank CAI for this opportunity. I think all of the Q&A webinars that you've had have been really helpful, and it lets us all share information and really try and help our communities. And to those of you who attended, I thank you too, because you guys are trying to get all the information you can get and really help your communities. And that's a big part of what we do, is really just educating each other, providing information, and getting the guidance out there. So if anybody has any questions kind of directly, feel free to email me or call. I don't know that we call very much anymore, but you're more than welcome to. So hope everybody stays safe out there and you know, tries to take care of themselves so that we can take care of others.
That's right. And in the spirit of what Sue said, certainly we all are one community, and we all are here to make communities better places, you know, for people to live. That's really our daily process. And so hopefully you gained a little bit from this webinar, but if there's anything that I can do to help answer some questions, I certainly am available to that beyond this webinar as well. The closing remark I would have would just be sure to thank your community volunteers. I certainly think if you listen to the questions today, you can hear the thread woven through there, that there's a common, kind of concern about how much, the boards are taking the brunt of this. And so make sure you thank them. Make sure you remind them that the vast majority of the homeowners really do appreciate them and that the community would not work without them.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brad. Thank you, Sue. Appreciate it so much. You sharing your time and expertise. And to everyone who joined us today, thank you for joining us. Please stay healthy and well. And as Sue mentioned, get some self-care because you guys are doing a lot for your communities and it is a stressful time. So please take the opportunity to take care of yourselves. Thanks, everybody. Look forward to talking with you again soon.
Bye.
Bye.